Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Principal Microsoft Technical Trainer. I'm excited to be your guide to learning path number 8, implementing API management. When you take a look at APIs, and especially in the world now that we deal with in a microservice world and where people are actually sharing APIs quite a bit, it's going to be very important for us to be able to manage these APIs. And that's really what I want to take a look at. So we're going to get into exploring what APIs are and how we have a management tool inside of Azure that will allow us to put a set of controls around how our users use our APIs, how our customers use our APIs, and how we might even use other people's APIs and manage that whole process. Now, we're going to get in and take a look at a number of the components and their functions within the graphical interface for the management. But I want to have a general conversation. First of all, what's an API and version control? These are all topics that relate to this one and are kind of adjunct to the whole thing. And I've been doing this for a while, and I love sitting in a room when someone says, well, I've got an API, and I always look around the room and look at some people's eyes, and you can see kind of this glazed over look. They kind of understand what they are, but they're not quite sure. We've also mentioned this to other parts of the recording, so I want to just address this here because this also is going to apply to things like other applications that you might be working with it in the platform as a service that might give you an indication of, are your applications available to move to a platform as a service? I didn't cover it in that platform as a service module. I want to address all of that here. So with this, I'm going to go off and do some whiteboarding for a bit. We're going to take a look at what an API is. We're going to take a look at versioning and why that's important for us, because it all relates back to what we're going to take a look at. So let's go off and do some whiteboarding. Before I get into the whiteboarding session, I want to show you a couple of pieces specifically around version control. Microsoft very strictly follows the semantic versioning number system that if you go to semver.org, you can see this on the website. It's actually fairly simple and straightforward, but not everybody follows it as strictly as we do. And what it does is it shows this numbering system that has a major, a minor, and a patch level. They've made a small adaptation for this to have a documented piece afterwards, but really it's those three numbers you're looking at. And you'll see that they define them specifically as, and we'll use the Microsoft terminology, a breaking change or a major change, which makes it incompatible with the previous versions. A minor change or a non-breaking change is typically adding features, but is backwardly compatible. And then you have a patch level. So we have in the Microsoft language a breaking change, a non-breaking change, and a patch level, or a major, minor, and patch. And understand what they do. And I'm going to show you how we follow it and how it might impact you from an app conversion into a platform as a service model. And this is a pretty straightforward document. There's only about a page worth of documentation on it. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, where this applies to maybe an earlier recording piece, I'm going to go back to the platform as a service offering when we took a look at a thing called an app service plan. And I mentioned in that recording that in the app service plan, you only have supported versions of the runtimes you're working with. So I'm in that blade right now, and you can see that when I come into wanting to deploy my app in this new modern way, as opposed to working with infrastructure as a service, I want to deploy my code to this runtime stack. And you can see that we have a variety of runtime stacks of .NET, ASP.NET, Java, Node, PHP, and Python. So they're all available to us there, but these are the currently supported versions. And I've had a number of customers as I went through, and I'm going to focus on ASP.NET. They said, oh, we're going to move to the cloud, but we can't do it because, our APIs, we're using 2.x. And they're actually maintaining a 2008 Windows server because that's what they were running ASP.NET 2 on. And they haven't been able to patch that server for a number of years. We haven't supported that operating system. They've had to air gap it, like all these constraints around it. And I said, well, why can't you upgrade it to, say, the current version of Windows? They said, well, it'll break our application. I said, well, why? And he goes, well, the API is no longer supported. You're only supporting 3.x and 4.x is a major change, and we call it a breaking change. And when you take a look at that, this is a whole group of APIs that we've published. And I go, well, what's going to break about your application? And go, we don't know. You just called it a breaking change. And you've got to be very careful that an API might or might not break your application. I'm going to do a demonstration of that in just a few minutes. So If you are thinking of an app conversion from an IaaS world to maybe a platform as a service, just because your application might be running on ASP.NET 1 or 2 doesn't mean that it won't work in ASP.NET 3.x or 4.x. It only is breaking if the feature that we deprecated, which qualifies it as a breaking change, if that has been the feature that you're using that's deprecated, yeah, it's going to break your application. But if the feature we deprecate isn't the one that you're using from the API set that you're working with, it's not going to break your application. And even if it was going to break it, you might just have to change and use the new API versions that's out there. So I'm going to do a demonstration of that, but I want to have this conversation here because APIs in general, I find, get misconstrued by a lot of people in understanding what they are. And where part of this confusion comes is Microsoft's strict adherence to that breaking change, non-breaking change, major, minor change. Because you take a look at some of these other products like Java, 8, 11, 17, 21, 25. Where's their .0.0? The minor changes, they don't follow that standard like Microsoft does. And like what happened to 9, 10 in between here? What happened to 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16? You take a look at Node. You got 20, 22, 24. You go to PHP. They have breaking changes at the, what is called the minor change. So not everybody follows this as closely as Microsoft. And I think that that's where some of the confusion has come in, that people have said, it's going to break my application. And absolutely a minor change in this case could potentially break your application from our perspective. But, in the Microsoft speak, a minor change will not break your application as you go through it. So just a bit of a preamble there. So take a look at APIs. So Microsoft makes available an API management service as one of the Azure services. Now, I've already gone through and deployed this. It takes quite a while, up to 30, 35 minutes to build all the necessary background infrastructure that's going to do it. We're going to go into the books and talk about some of the features, but I want to show them to you in here, and you can see where version control and some of the things we just talked about is going to come in. There are several pieces that come along with the API management. There is a feature called a gateway, which is going to be the control plane in which people will gain access to your APIs that you could then put things called policies in place to shape how the API is going to be used. You can bundle them up in packages and secure them with subscriptions. All this is going to be covered in the material we're going to be using in just a few minutes. But understand there's quite a bit that comes along here. So in addition to the gateway, we also have a thing called the developer portal that provides a website that you could then go to provide users access to your APIs so they can maybe come in and use your APIs, whether it be internal to your organization or potentially to a vendor community or someone else that might be using your APIs. Now, this is showing me the ability to write in the tool actually design and work with the developer portal. So this is just a template that they've put forward. You can customize this and make it any way that you want. Now, I showed this the other day, and I'm going to come back in. I'm going to show you graph.microsoft.com, and you'll see a very similar look and feel that this has got a portal for it. And guess what's behind this portal? It's all the graph APIs for the Microsoft M365 data estate. So if you want to go take a look at that module, we took a look at the graph data. This is basically just the API management that you now have access to all of the APIs for Excel and for PowerPoint and for Teams and Outlook that you can now come and use this basically done from this API management feature. Now, this is the design tool for it. You can actually go see the production version of that tool. If I come into the overview, I can actually see the deployed URL, and it gives me a slightly different look and feel. I'm not going to get the design features, but this is going to show me, I can come here, I can sign in so you can have some authentication. We'll be talking about this when we get back to the course materials. I can then restrict which APIs you can gain access to based around a subscription that we're going to assign to you. I can explore what APIs are available to, very similar to what I was just showing you, that I can get into my Echo APIs and my MTT demo conference APIs, and it's then going to list all the APIs that are available to me. So this is going to give me that capability to do exactly what I was showing you in the Microsoft Graph environment. I want to come down and show you specifically the APIs that are brought in. Now you can import or create your APIs from this graphical interface, and you saw it on the developer portal that I had an Echo API and an MTT demo conference. So I have a set of APIs that I've been able to import here, and you can see from my API design, I've got a get session, get sessions, get speaker, get speakers. And so these are the APIs that someone could call. So if I was running a conference and I had my application for my conference, somebody could come to my website or my API site, and maybe they wanted to take an app that they wanted to write for their employees to come to our conference, and they say, we're going to actually tailor this so that you don't have to go to the conference website, my website. I can have an application that could use these APIs to extract some of the information by calling the APIs and use my source data to actually populate this for their application that they're working with. Now, what you're going to see in here, let's just scroll over and show some more of this. The API itself is then going to have several components. There is a front end, so this is an inbound through the gateway, and we're going to show you that we have some policies that we can create. I have an inbound, I have a back end, and then I have an outbound. So front end, inbound processing, a back end, outbound processing, and then the front end. So I've got a little chart that shows you where these policies are going to apply and how they apply in what order. But there's a whole set of controls that I can work with at each one of these, and we're going to show you some of the policies that can be created and the type of controls that you can put in these different areas to modify the traffic, whether it be changing headers. You can actually have some applications, and I've got an example that I'll be talking about where it's not natively available from the API management. By adding things like Azure Functions, which we've talked about in other recordings, things like Logic App, I could actually do some processing to actually put maybe a watermark on a save feature because you're using a demo version of my API, and until you either pay or register for the subscription of the API, you're not going to get full access to it. There's lots of controls that we can put around this feature set. Now, what you can then do is I've got this API set. You can see all the APIs in my conference. I can come under the products. Now, I can create a product. I'm going to call it record demo. I can give it some description. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put subscription count limits, and then I'm going to add what APIs that I want to add to this subscription. And I can pick from one or more API sets. So this is kind of a cool feature, at least I think, that I can now take maybe 2 or 3 different APIs from a group of APIs. I could bundle them up. And this often happens, internally for organizations. If you're working on a project, I don't want to give you access to the entire API library. I'm going to give you access to the set of APIs that we feel that you're going to need for that project that you're working with. So I can come in and grab from the API set. And I've now got a record demo. It's not published. And if I did want to publish it, if I went to the site, it would then show up as an option that somebody could then subscribe to. So it is a product. And so you take your APIs, you bundle them up into products, and then you make those products available through potentially a thing called a subscription. And so you now can say add a subscription. Go back into record demo. What is the scope it down to a product. What product version do I want to work with? Record demo. And so I'm now going to create a subscription for Can You See Me? And these are going to be the keys that you can then give to somebody so that they can gain access. And this is a way to secure that subscription that gives them access to those APIs that are they can then use. So all sorts of great ways to get in and work with the API management itself. So that gives you a bit of an idea of what it is that we're looking at. So let's get back into the course material itself. So what API management is going to provide for you is a single pane of glass to take your APIs and bundle them up and make them available. And where this is going to be really valuable, especially as you start getting into microservices and you've got maybe hundreds or thousands of microservice apps that you need the APIs to tie those all together. And I always use the example of maybe I have an app that I'm building that says, I don't have very much, but I have an idea where I want to take, people who want to get picked up and drop them off someplace. And I want to pair them up with people who have cars and vehicles that want to pick people up and drop them off. I'm going to start writing an application in a microservice model to do that. And so I can, keep adding features. And so that's the benefit of microservices. Every single day, as I write new features, I come up with that minimal viable product that I originally deployed. And I keep adding features that allow you to rate the drivers. And the drivers go, wait, I want to rate the passengers so they can rate you. And so you're constantly adding new APIs and new application features that allow that capability. And eventually you've got a pretty mature application. And you sit there, gosh, I want to be able to be able to expand my business. And would it be nice if I could maybe pick up some foods from someplace and drop it off? It's not a whole new application. You're just extending your application functionality to bring in this new feature. But now I need to get the APIs of all those restaurants so I can get their menus. All these kind of reasons of this API economy are a real, driving force for not just how your business runs internally using your APIs, but how you might communicate into a broader community of users where you can offer services or use other people's services by tying into their APIs. And so you take a look at the API management services, as I said, it provides that single pane of glass for you to be able to manage this, whether they be your APIs, making them available internally, your APIs made available to other people to use, or you going to someone else's APIs and using them. And a lot of organizations, just don't want you willy-nilly going off and using somebody else's APIs. I'm going to say, I'm going to use a third-party API, but I'm going to control that API. Similar to what I did is I downloaded that conference demo and I published them in my API management. So there's someone else's APIs, but I'm now going to control them through my API management. And you can see on that right-hand part of the slide some of those pieces. There's the Azure portal that we can use to manage this. You can also do this programmatically using the ARM templates. There's bicep capabilities. There's a lot of different SDKs that are available and the REST APIs that you can work with. There's the API gateway, which is that in-place control that you can work with to have those policies at the front end, the inbound, the back end, the outbound, and then again, back through the gateway itself. And then we have that developer portal of the different components that make up the API management services. The books, if you're following along in the aka.ms/course AZ-204, they have a lot of descriptions. I've described these already for you, but what is a product? And a product is a grouping of one or more APIs that you've bundled together that you could then make available by, instead of having to have just this long list of APIs and letting the individual find them, you can actually package them up to meet your specific requirements. We have groups that you can use to manage the visibility of the products, that for your developers. We have the developers themselves. We have policies, and policies are just a set of controls that you can take a standard API and, as I said, put a wrapper around it. So, for example, and this is not as simple as I'm going to make it sound, but I could put a wrapper around to say, hey, you can use this API. And I can now put, say, a save limit on it. So until you subscribe, and it might not even cost you anything, so it's not like a paid subscription, maybe I just want you to register. And by registering the API, I now know who's done or used that API, and that way I can communicate with you to indicate that maybe there's a change to it. You might want to be notified of that change. So by having policies, I could actually put a wrapper around the API that allows you to, say, save a file in whatever size that you want. Well, I could now put a policy around it that says, unless you've got the subscribed version of this, there's a free version or unregistered version that we're going to put a storage limit on it. You can't store something over, say, 5 megabytes. And so you could play with it and try it, but you're not going to potentially be able to save it in its full capacity. So there's all sorts of things you can do with these policies without having to create separate APIs. So you can wrap policies around them and then bundle those up with product sets that you're working with to say, hey, here's the free product set and here's the subscribed for product set, just to distinguish them. And then we've already talked about the developer portal itself. So the API gateway plays this key role that provides this central repository or traffic. It's like a proxy server that's now going to allow you and the clients to communicate with those services and provide this control that you can put onto it. And it's where you're going to apply your policies in an ordered list to get them from the front end through to the back end. Where do I apply these policies? And I would encourage you to get in and play with and explore all the different types of policies, because there's a different set at each of those different levels of the front end, the inbound, the back end, and the outbounds, and then again through the front end. Different kinds of policies that you might be able to have at those different levels. So there is ways that you can actually use the APIs without the gateway. You're not going to get those controls. And depending on the level of control you want to work with, this becomes a choice of yours. But a lot of people will use the gateway. Now you want to make sure that, from a traffic perspective, you could even put limits on the traffic through the gateway to make sure that people are not oversubscribing or consuming the resources you're working with. So there's quite a bit of functional requirements that you can enforce by using the gateway, but it doesn't have to be something that you work with. We've already talked about the role of policies and its ability to be able to come through and control an API without having to republish an API in different formats. It's just kind of a wrapper that sits around it. This is kind of a standard Microsoft concept where we've had group policy objects that allow you to take a deployment and then change it slightly based around the group policy object that modifies how the underlying services are going to be working with. But the policies are a way to be able to create customizations of the APIs without actually having to fundamentally change the base API itself. This is just showing you an example of that policy. It's just going to be a JSON document that you're working with. And, for example, that I used earlier on that right-hand side, the left-hand side is just a blank one that's going to indicate, is it on the inbound? Is it at the back end? Is it on the outbound? Is it at the front end of the policies? And you can then write whatever you want. The example I would have used is, more like the one on the right-hand side where you might say, on the inbound, as a person's trying to use the API to maybe save something, you could say what is the size of the request, and if it's greater than a specific size, I want to be able to, or I'm going to send back a message saying that this is too large for the version of the API that you're working with. So you can actually have these policies that handle that process. So what are they going to basically do? They control the flow. They can forward requests. I said this is the kind of a general concept of what you can do. And I would encourage you to get into the graphical interface when you do the lab, and you'll see that these values are available at different characteristics at the different levels of the front end, the inbound, the back end, the outbound, and again, back through the front end. Just again, a couple more examples of what the policies might look like for the configurations of a characteristic that you might want to work with, but you'll be able to write whatever it is that you need. And I said they can get quite complex. The example that I was talking about of having a watermark, I've done this one where, yes, you can save a file, but I'm going to actually modify that file and add a watermark to the saved version of that API that you're working with. Now, I can't do that with the API management because I actually have to then manipulate the file. So if you're going to give me a file and I'm going to put a watermark on it, I have to be able to do that through, as I said, maybe it's an Azure function that's going to get called, or a logic app will then take the file that you're saving and manipulating it, because I can only control the activity, not the manipulation of the data. In the case of that file, I'm going to need an external source to do that, but it is something that I could do. So when you take a look at these subscriptions, the subscription is not necessarily a paid subscription. It is a process of a user or an individual registering for the subscription, whether you give them the keys, whether they can come through some online request to get it and you approve it, or is it just a a manual process that they have. You send them the keys, and that subscription key will give them access to the products that are associated with that subscription. So you can have a subscription for all APIs, you can have a single API that you're working with, or for that product definition that I just showed. And here's the graphical interface that I was showing you in the demonstration, where you can actually come into the subscriptions and have a number of them that you would have users then register for. So having the users request the subscription and make the request using the subscription key that you have, you'll notice that there were 2 keys. And that allows for key rotation so that you can have a new set of keys. If something has had a key compromised, you want to get rid of that key so it's no longer usable, you have this capability for a key rotation with those 2 keys. The other thing you can do is secure your APIs using certificates. And so this is a process where you can come through, and whether it is a certificate that we use and then we issue you the certificate, whether I trust your certificate, and you can then come through and use that certificate and the TTLs to be able to control access to the APIs. And here's that method of being able to accept them. So you're accepting a client certificate. So you're going to use your certificate. I'm going to give you my certificate. I'm going to trust your certificate authority. So several different ways in which we can use certificates to secure our APIs. So this gets us to an exercise where you're going to get in and actually perform the API management deployment. Now, the actual deployment takes a little while. So while the lab is, rated for fairly long, most of it is actually going to be spent just waiting for the lab to deploy. We have a recording of it. I'm going to clip all that out, so it's going to appear much faster than it might actually happen in the real world if you're doing it. But we'll see in a few minutes after the lab.
In this lab, we're going to create an Azure API Management instance. We're going to import an Open API specification backend API, and then we're going to configure the API settings, including the web services URL, a subscription requirement, and then test the API operations to verify that it works correctly. Let's get into this. I'm first going to open up Cloud Shell. And if you haven't been in here before, it'll go through some setup requirements. I have been, so that's not an issue. What I want to do is create a couple of variables that will be used later on in my CLI. Now I'm going to create the API instance. This could take upwards of 20 minutes to create. I'm going to shorten this timeline on the recording. Okay, and close that down. Let's go and take a look at the resource group. So it was created. Here's my API management. Let's go and take a look at this. Expand out the APIs. So we currently don't have any APIs under management. We're going to actually add that now. API, just the full. HTTPS. And then create. So all our operators. Going to test. Find pets by status. Let's say send. We'll see what the call is, and we'll see our 200. So pretty straightforward, just the loading and execution of the APIs, and they seem to work properly. Let's go back to the recording.
So welcome back. We're going to close out this module, taking a look at our knowledge check. So question number 1, what component of an API management service would a developer use if they needed to create an account and subscription to get an API? You can pause the recording. That would be the developer portal where they could come to see the APIs that you've published and then potentially subscribe to that through the developer portal. Question number 2, what API management policy would you use to apply a policy based on a condition? Go ahead and stop the recording for a second. What do you think of your answer? So the option would be the choose policy feature that would go through a conditional check to see which of the policies would apply for the condition in which it's being used. So this brings us to not only the end of the module, but the end of the learning path. This is a fairly straightforward and simple one. And we've shown you, first of all, why you might be concerned about using APIs and using API management for yours or third-party applications, making them available to both your internal users as well as potential external users. And API management provides for this new API economy. More and more organizations are using this API economy to share their APIs, as I said, both internally and externally, to get features and functionalities and having organizations work together. Especially in this microservice world, you're going to have those APIs tie all that together. We saw that through a gateway and a developer portal. We have the capabilities to control through subscriptions and policies and product creation what APIs are made available, how they're going to be controlled, and how they're going to be used through the policies that you enforce at the various levels. So with that, I hope you've understood a bit more about APIs. I also did a little bit extra on, what is that SEMVer numbering system, which you can now enforce as you go through and make changes to your API publishing. What versions are you working with and making those available using a numbering system for version control. But with that, hopefully you've enjoyed this recording. I look forward to seeing you at a future recording.